The Python Show.
Hello and welcome to the Python Show. My name is Mike Driscoll, your host, and today we have an awesome special guest, Al Sweigart, the author of Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. He has told me today that
Hey,
he is
thanks for
working
having
on the
me.
third
It's
edition.
great to be on this
Welcome to the
show.
show, Al. Yeah, it's great to have you. It's always fun to have a chat with the
The Automate
well-known
guy.
Al. Yes. Everyone,
I mean,
do
the
people
the one
call you
thing that
Automate or
I get a
something
lot
nowadays, or
is
is it
people
just
making the same joke of like, "Hey, have you thought about automating book writing?" And it gets funnier every time. But but yeah, and actually, I have with ChatGPT, and it turns out it's not that great for that. But we can also go into that later on.
Yes, I do want to talk a little bit about that because I've been playing with it for automating article writing, and I'm not impressed. But we'll get there eventually. So, one of my first questions that I've been asking my guests lately is to just tell a little bit about yourself and
Oh,
how did you
well,
get into
so talking about
programming
how I got into
anyway?
programming is a story that I really hate telling, completely, absolutely. So how I got into programming um,
Oh,
was I was in
okay.
the third grade, I think, and a friend got a book on programming games in BASIC from the library,
Hmm.
and I saw this book, and I was really into Nintendo as a kid, and I was like, yeah, I want to make Mario and Zelda. I never did. I instead made, guess the number games
Mm-hmm.
and really simple stuff like that. But it was great because it was a time where
Mm-hmm.
text-based games were okay. The expectations were really low. Like today, if you talk about software,
Yeah.
we're all walking around with supercomputers in our pockets. And so we think about self-driving cars and AI and
Mm-hmm.
social networks with millions of users, and guess the number really isn't all that impressive compared to that. So I I'm glad that I learned programming back then because I could just
Yeah.
have fun with it, and there wasn't any real pressure. And also, by the time I graduated high school, the head start of several years that I had really wasn't that big of a head start because I didn't have YouTube tutorials or Wikipedia or all of these other resources. I mean, I didn't have Python
Mm-hmm.
back then. It was available back in the 90s, but I didn't know about it. Um, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I hate talking about how I learned to program because a lot of people hear that story about yet another guy who started coding when they were a kid, and then they think, "Oh no, I wasn't getting on the internet when I was a kid and I'll never be able to catch up." And it's like, "No, no, no. My head start really wasn't that much of a head start." Programming is definitely something that I'm really convinced that everyone uh, who is interested in doing it and sticks with it can learn to program. Um, Teaching programming, on the other hand, that's incredibly difficult, and lots of people are lousy at it, and that's why a lot of people think that programming is so hard. Is just because the learning materials aren't that great sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. People should not get frustrated about not being able to or not getting into programming early enough. I mean, I didn't get into it until I got into university, and I wasn't especially good at it either until I actually started doing it full time. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's
I
normal.
think back
It's okay.
on because I have a CS degree that I got from the University of Texas at Austin, and I think back at some of those classes, and I realize much
Hmm.
more now, like with a lot of the theoretical computer science stuff, because I've read more into it. And but I think like, oh, I could do so much better in all of those
Hmm.
classes. I would not be a B average student. I would because I actually know more, but I think the worst
Yeah.
thing about college was just having to learn so much in such a tight schedule, and the sleep deprivation and everything like that. And it's one of the nice things about being an adult right now is that
Hmm.
I have a bit more time and I can actually learn things to the degree that I want to learn them, and take the time to actually master things instead of cram a bunch of information into my head and then take a test and then move on to the next thing, whether I understand it or
Yeah.
not. Uh,
Yeah, that was probably my biggest beef with learning in college is you're basically memorizing all the
yeah,
facts, but you don't really understand
and
how to
so for
apply
a lot
them.
of my books, I try to
And
focus mostly on having these little programs that do a complete thing, not just code snippets of some algorithm, but fun little programs so you can see how
mhm,
for loops and variables and everything all come together to do a thing. And you can actually see, oh yes, there's a point behind all of these concepts, and then you can apply them and sort of
mhm,
gain mastery over these concepts that way instead of just learning abstract facts.
yeah. Yeah, one thing, I don't know if it's still true or not, but when I was in college, they didn't teach you a lot of the concepts that are like everyone talks about, like test-driven development, dry, solid programming techniques. They didn't even test testing at all. That was something I was never taught in college, and I wonder, is it taught now? I really need to ask some of the new people,
It's
the younger
very
people.
flattering that you think I'm
Is any of this
the
stuff
younger
taught
person, but
now? Is they
anyway,
taught?
in the 2000s, I'm going to make that vague enough. When I was in school, yeah, we did cover JUnit. Java was sort of the programming language that was being taught at the time, and
Hmm.
I think since then UT Austin has switched to Python, as many schools have. But they did cover some unit
Hmm.
testing, but I mean, it's always hard because with computer science, you don't want to just teach practical things because all that will be obsolete by the time you graduate. But if you just
Yeah.
teach theoretical things, and it's kind of hard to see what you can actually do with those concepts and things like that. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, for sure, software engineering and learning how to write code and write code to a specification and find bugs and do testing and on all of these things, that is a
Hmm.
completely different skill set from computer science itself. And in many ways, you can graduate with a
Hmm.
4 year computer science degree and not really be that good at programming. it's They are related and adjacent, but not
Yeah.
necessarily the same thing.
They are. I mean, I have an associate's in computer in comp sci and a bachelor's in management information systems. And the computer science to me seems like it's mostly theory. Management information series is a
Yeah.
little bit more applied, but it also has a lot
Yeah.
of
I mean,
business
I half joke
concepts
that
added to it.
big O algorithm analysis is like 80% of the usefulness of my computer science degree, um, which is a concept I cover in a chapter in
Mm.
my book, Beyond the Basic Stuff with Python. I'm just going to throw in a plug of my books there. Yeah, I mean, so I
Good. I
always
want to check that one
freely
out.
plug my
So,
books because they're all free online under a Creative Commons license. So at inventwithpython.com or
mhm.
whatever BitTorrent site that you can that you know of. I'm sure they're all over there as well. Um, but yeah, yeah, I have them available on my website as well.
Do you ever consider, creating domains for separate books, or do you
I
just like keep
thought
them all
about it.
on Invent with Python?
Um, I originally set up inventwithpython.com, and then I set up an automate the boring stuff with .com, and I really wish I had just kept it all on
Hmm.
one website,
I remember that.
because then if I have like separate domains, then I'm sure it affects the
Mm.
search engine, uh, the SEO rankings and everything. Yeah, it's
Uh,
another concept
SEO.
outside of computer science and programming that's tech adjacent that I have to learn. My website
Hmm.
is clearly designed by a programmer. It's yeah,
I think it's pretty good overall. It may not be flashy like a business website, but it's
yeah.
it's
I try to keep
functional and it's easy
the
to
web
navigate.
page loads under 100 kilobytes. just including images and everything else. Mostly I just have readers all across the world, and not
Mhm.
everybody has a good internet connection, and it's just sort of a pain when you have to just sit there and
Yeah.
it loads the template or the general website, and then you see all these little spinners everywhere, and it takes like another 7 seconds to load. And I just, hey, it's just images and text, so it doesn't have to be that
Yeah.
complicated. Oh yeah,
Yeah, and that works good on
oh
mobile
yeah.
devices too, usually, which for to me, that's probably where I have the most latency is, I live in Iowa, so you go, off the highway and you have your
Oh
internet
yeah, for
connection goes
sure.
crack to crap. So, um, because it's rural, I mean, there's not very many people out in the cornfields, so they don't have good coverage. And if you want to like go outside and hang out, at a park at a
Mhm.
like a what do they call them? Like a national park type
Oh,
area, you're
that's
probably
why
not
I've
going to
just
be
put
that
a
close
giant
to a cell phone
spool of
tower.
fiber optic
And
cable on
so
top of my car. I just plug it into my home, and then I'll just I'll spool it behind me.
that would be so expensive to have someone hit that. Anyway, so you've mentioned automating the boring stuff a couple of times now. How about you
Yeah,
tell us?
I had started
How did that
writing
book come
programming
about?
books kind of just as a hobby around 2009, and I wrote one that was invent your own computer games with
Mm-hmm.
Python, and then I wrote another one, and then another one, and Automate the Boring Stuff was my fourth book, and the previous ones I had all self-published. So I approached, actually, No Starch Press
Cool.
had approached me previously about talking about um, writing books for them,
Mm-hmm.
and so I pitched this idea to them, and it came out in 2015, which was really a right book at the right time,
Mm-hmm.
because that's when Python was really taking off with data science
Mm-hmm.
and other areas that Python was being used more and more in. And there were a lot of beginners out there, and they were looking for free
Yeah.
resources. And I had experience writing some books, and so it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
completely terrible. And mostly, I had been thinking a lot about this idea of like everyone needs to learn to code, which I somewhat agree with. I think a lot of times people mistake that for everyone needs to become a software engineer, and that's certainly not true. But computers are it's sort of like everyone should have
Mm-hmm.
a driver's
Yeah.
license. Like this is sort of a skill in our modern world that's, not everybody does have a driver's license, but it's knowing how to drive is a
Mm-hmm.
useful thing to have even if you don't own a car. And the same thing with programming. We're all
Yeah.
walking around with supercomputers in our pockets right now, and it'd be great if we could figure out ways to
Mm-hmm.
get them to do precisely what we want. And so I started thinking about, okay, well, what are the things that people need to know if everybody, like if your accountant or a plumber or anyone was
Mm-hmm.
could learn to program. And so I wanted to throw out all that computer science stuff. Like you don't need to know big O algorithm analysis. You don't need to know, uh, in fact, even like
Mm-hmm.
object oriented programming. I don't cover classes and other things like that in Automate the Boring Stuff because technically you don't need it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's this added layer of complexity. And the book already is like 550
Yeah.
pages long, with the second edition, and the third edition that I'm working on right now
Mm-hmm.
is possibly going to make that a little bit longer. I'm trying to keep that under wraps. Um, but I thought, okay, well, things
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, I'd like to write a program that can move files around automatically, like rename them, move them, copy, delete. Be great if you could send emails or text
Mm-hmm.
notifications. If you could download websites. If you knew regular expressions, that's kind
Mm-hmm.
of a computer science thing, but that's really useful for detecting patterns of text
Mm-hmm.
and pulling that out of other stuff, and just extracting data from
Yeah.
one format, whether it's a website or a spreadsheet, or a text file, and then putting it into another format, some other spreadsheet or text file or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I had my whole list of these things, and I wrote them down. And so, automate the boring stuff. Part one was as little Python as you can get away with knowing. And then part two was just a collection of all of these third-party
Mm-hmm.
modules, because Python has PyPI, the Python package index, that I think at this point has like
Mm-hmm.
460,000 projects uploaded to it. Most of them you'll never need or
Mm-hmm.
want to use or something, but it really is a great resource because there's so much out
Yeah.
there. Like I'm really glad I didn't have to write a package for uh, parsing Excel spreadsheets or reading PDF files. That would have
Mm-hmm.
been a giant task just on their own. But
Yeah.
other people have done that, and they've made their code available, and everybody benefits from sharing
Mm-hmm.
all of this code like that. And so I wanted to just sort of have all this general knowledge, and it turns out that a lot of people find useful information to be useful. um, who knew? And so, I also wanted to
Yeah.
make this book available, so I put it under a Creative Commons license. And at first, that was mostly because I didn't really think of myself as an author. I
Mm-hmm.
I was still a software developer. I wasn't writing full time
Mm-hmm.
then, and so I thought, yeah, I'll just throw it online for free. That's fine. I'll put it under a Creative Commons license, which actually really helped it
Mm-hmm.
generate word of mouth because people had actually heard of it.
I considered doing a free version of my book with a publisher, and I never did it because, you know, I don't think most of the publishers I've worked with would allow me to have a free
Yeah,
version
and
and then
and
the
that's
paid
a big
version.
reason I went with No Starch
You know.
Press, was because they were all right with that. I mean, I haven't talked with them directly, but I kind of get the feeling it's because, well, they know that books are always going to be pirated no matter what, and so you're really not costing yourself
Mm-hmm.
a lot of sales. I mean, probably most of the people who pirate my book don't even read it, so it just sits on their hard drive. So is that really a lost sale? Well, probably
Mm-hmm.
not actually. Um, but but meanwhile, there are a lot of people who
Yeah.
started reading the free version online, and they really liked that they could just flip through any part of it, and then later decided, hey, they'd like to buy the ebook copy or a print book copy of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's I've No Starch Press was just the first publisher to reach out to me, and so I started publishing books with them, and uh, it's been a great relationship, and I really haven't seen a huge need to check out the other publishers. Although, yeah, I really do like a lot of O'Reilly's books,
Yeah.
and the books from
I
like Manning and A Press and all the other publishers as well.
Yeah. I think you did a good. I think you had a good choice with No Starch because every time I've worked with them doing as a technical reviewer, I've really liked the
Yeah,
quality
yeah,
and
it's
the
really nice.
effort that their editors put into their
They
books.
allow me to just run past every single deadline that we kind of set up, or at least I'll give them a deadline. It's like, I will have this done by this date, and that date will come, and it will go, and I'll still be working on it. They're fine. They really want a high quality book. They understand that, okay, sure, you might be able to launch a book 3 months
Okay.
earlier, but in the long run, is it is that 3 month head start really worth it, to have a low
Mm-hmm.
quality book? Um, but one of the things that we can switching over to
Yeah.
ChatGPT. I recently used ChatGPT as a technical
Mm-hmm.
reviewer of sorts of my recursion book, the recursive book of recursion, and I just fed the text of the book to ChatGPT and instructed it to
Mm-hmm.
find any mistakes in the text. And I wrote up a blog post about this and put it on the Invent with Python
Okay.
blog, and it was really interesting. Um, I mean,
Was it finding problems with the book's text or the
kind of
code or
all of those
both?
things,
Or did it not even work?
actually. So let's see if I remember it correctly. I had like 185 bits of feedback. I went through and like cataloged all of these, and about
Hmm.
14% of these were actual problems that it found, and more than just spelling and grammar, it was actual like conceptual
Hmm.
mistakes that were in the book. I think, like, for example, one thing is I said
Hmm.
aspect ratio gets bigger, the image gets taller, and as it decreases, it gets wider. And actually, it's the other way around. And so,
Hmm.
ChatGPT is able to
Okay.
understand the concepts and point out when these mistakes are being made 14% of the time. Um, However, 25% of the time, it just
Yeah.
totally gave me the wrong answers, like just wrong information. If I followed its advice, I would be
Mm.
introducing more errors into the book. And that was, and it's amazing
Okay.
how confidently it stated both the correct and wrong information that it had for me. It's really confident
Hmm.
in talking about things it has no idea uh, or no clue about. So you can tell it's a product of Silicon Valley from that. um,
Well, yeah, if it helped about a lot when I was talking to a friend of mine. And the first, I think it was the second episode for this podcast, he was telling me how an LLM works. And basically, it is trying to guess the
yes,
next word that you're going to type. And by doing that, sometimes it's going to give you a completely wrong answer because it's already trying to figure out what your
right.
question
Yeah, it
is
can.
before you finish writing the
Yeah,
question.
you can give it prompts
And
where
so,
you're asking it for questions, and it can understand context and things like that. But um,
mhm.
y- yes, for
Sometimes you have to
sure.
refine it, the prompt multiple
Yeah,
times to get
and
it
that was so 14%
exactly the way
correct
you
and
want.
25% wrong. And then the rest of the time it was just sort of, not wrong, but the advice it had wasn't really relevant or wasn't all that helpful. It would suggest different rewordings of the text, and I thought, yeah, I could word it like that, but you'd basically be saying the same thing, so it wasn't that useful. The thing that I noticed definitely about this whole process
Yeah.
was that you absolutely can't replace a human reviewer with ChatGPT. If anything, although I do think that it has a
Mhm.
place in the whole process, but if anything, it's going to slow down the reviewer, because then you have to spend time going through all of this output from the LLM and figure out what's correct
Mhm.
and what's not, and what's actually useful, and that's going to require the same expertise that a human has. And so it's going to slow you down, but
Yeah.
it will improve the quality by finding these problems that made it past the author and made it past the reviewers, um, which was actually, it was really
Yeah.
nice. But of course, anytime you hear about ChatGPT or AI in general, it's amazing how AI just can mean anything to anyone. Most of the reporting on it is just nonsense.
Mhm.
People are There is something
Yep.
there, but I feel like, I don't know. People have started to figure out that cryptocurrency and NFTs are a complete scam, and so now we're sort of expecting, like, well, what's the next big thing that's going to come
Mhm.
out of Silicon Valley? Like, sure, we all switched to smartphones, and social media really blew up, but that was
Mhm.
well over a decade ago at this point, and we're sort of looking for the next big thing, and self-driving cars hasn't really happened
Yeah.
either. Uh, and I think a lot of people are pinning their hopes on
Yeah.
making AI this huge thing. I have noticed that in the last few years, whenever people read my name as text, Al
Mm.
Sweigart, they immediately think that it says AI Sweigart, which I guess I find it kind of annoying. um,
Yeah, I get that. I think for me, what I've seen that machine learning does well is it's good at analyzing like photos and detecting abnormalities. So like for medicine, it's good for like checking X-rays or
yeah,
MRIs for
if you can have it
abnormalities. That
focus
stuff is good
on a
for
very specific
to some
domain.
degree.
Large language models are interesting because they know
Yeah.
everything, but their understanding is about an inch deep. Um, So they can give you some facts
Mhm.
and they can give you context for facts, but they also, you never know if what they're saying is correct or not. You always, like, it's not that it's wrong like 2% of the time. It's,
Yeah, it's
full for me in that one instance, whole quarter of the time, 1 in 4 times, it was just completely wrong information or just mostly useless information. So
yeah.
yeah,
I like
you
it
can
for
get like a
brainstorming, but that's
skeleton
about
of
it
an
so far.
idea, but it's I've heard that a lot of foreign language translators have gotten really upset with machine translation because it'll do mostly a terrible job, and then but the client will, run it through Google Translate and then hand them this and say, "Oh, you just have to clean this up," and really they have to rewrite everything. Um,
Mhm.
it's but
Yeah.
it is fairly incredible because it's not like Eliza chatbot, which was from the 60s or the 70s, and it would just sort of give you these vague generic responses like, "Oh, that's interesting, why do you say blah blah blah." I would just repeat what you're saying back at you, and humans are so
Mhm.
self-absorbed. We can talk to a volleyball with a handprint on it and think that we're making a new friend there. We don't really notice that the conversation isn't going anywhere.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit of that. So, you mentioned the recursion book. I'm just curious, how did you end up choosing
It
that as a
was
topic for a book?
sort of a huge accident. um, I, for the longest time, I thought like, oh, I should write like
Mhm.
a follow up book to automate the boring stuff, and then also a third edition to automate the boring stuff. But I really didn't know
Mhm.
what I was gonna do with that exactly, so I was still planning that out. And I thought, hey, recursion is something that people are really confused by. They find it really intimidating as a topic. Um,
Mhm.
at the same time,
Yep.
there's not that much to it. I could write a really short book on recursion, like maybe 150 pages or something like that, and it would be really short and sweet. I
Mhm.
could have it done in 6 months. It'd be great. It'd be easy, and I'll just be working on that while I'm planning out what these other
Mhm.
books will be. And I was sort of writing that out, and I got a lot of it done. And then No Starch said, actually, people don't really like these shorter books. We kind of want something that's more substantial. Can you add like another 100 pages to that? I said, sure, yeah. I mean, I can. The hard part is keeping it a small book. I can always add like 100 pages of stuff, and so I added all these fun little projects. But yeah, so for audience members who don't know or who have only vaguely heard about it, a recursive function is a function that calls itself, which sounds really weird, and it kind of is, but
Mhm.
only at first. And it's there's a whole category of problems that are easier to solve with recursion. The trouble is there's a whole category of problems to solve that recursion is totally over engineered for, and you're just overcomplicating things. But a lot of
Mhm.
programmers like using recursion because it makes them feel clever to come up with the recursive algorithm for it. Uh, I'm gonna have like the functional programmers yelling at me for
Yes.
that, but and I found that it's not really that difficult of a topic, but it is often taught poorly. And so I went through a bunch of different recursion tutorials I saw online. Um,
Mm.
I feel like a lot of computer science is taught the way it's taught because computer science sort of grew out of mathematics in an academic setting, and recursion
Mhm.
is sort of like that. You always see the same very math based examples like factorial and the Fibonacci sequence, and those are the prime
Yeah.
examples. Which is funny because actually
Mhm.
you would never use recursion in the real world to solve those to write those algorithms. It turns out the recursive algorithms for factorial and Fibonacci are terrible. um, but they're simple enough that they make for good examples. and
Mm.
and I thought like, okay, well, what are the ways that people
Yeah.
really make this scarier? and so I wrote up a whole list of things. It's like, oh yeah, tutorials never really mention the call stack or kind of explain that, and it's this thing that's not in the source code. It's handled by the interpreter, by your compiler
Mm.
in the background, and because it's invisible, people don't see it, and so it sort of seems mysterious because they're not really thinking about it, and the whole process just becomes a lot more cryptic than necessary. And so I had that and a bunch of other
Yeah.
little things about like recursion, and I wanted to have all the basic examples like factorial and Fibonacci and tree traversal algorithms, and all that's very computer sciencey, but I also just wanted to have some fun projects in it as well. So I
Hmm.
have like a fractal drawer to make these really interesting uh, bits of like geometric artwork. So that's in the book, and you can
Oh, cool.
use Python for that. And actually, all the code examples have Python and JavaScript code sort of side by side. I just have the equivalent code in both those languages because I
Mm.
didn't want this to be just a Python book. It was a general programming book. But I have those
Okay.
those pictures that
Cool.
contain themselves. This is called the Drost effect. Drost effect. I'm not. It's I believe it's a Dutch word. There's a brand of cocoa
Hmm.
called that, and their logo, the illustration on the tins was
Mm.
somebody holding a tray of with a cup of hot cocoa, and then the tin of cocoa there. And so, of course, on that tin of cocoa is the illustration itself, and
Okay.
which has the person holding the tray, and then on that tray there was a tin, and
Mm.
so forth. And so it's like, oh, that's really clever. And of
Yeah.
course, the cover of the book is this robot reading the book itself. So then you see the cover. There's a robot on that cover, and
Hmm.
therefore, and so on and so on. Yeah, so
I like that.
it was
That's
really. I think
fun.
that book came out last year in 2022, and I had first started on it in 2018. Actually, I mean, I've been working on like different things at the same time, but
Wow.
um, yeah, it's sort of like a lot of ideas came together, uh, and it's out now, and it's also on inventwithpython.com. If anything, you can. Oh, go ahead.
Have you had? I was just wondering. Have you had like good
Yeah,
response
I
to that
mean,
book? Are people like enjoying it, or
automate the boring stuff because
you're not getting any feedback?
it sort of hit this spotlight, and it's for beginners and a wide audience. It sells really well, but my books get good reviews, but
Hmm.
none of them really sell as well as automate. And so recursion, it is an interesting and fun topic if you're the type of
Hmm.
person who finds learning about programming stuff to be interesting and fun. So it doesn't sell a lot of copies, but at the same
Yeah.
time, I'm hoping that a lot of people who are, they're a computer science student, and they're like, oh no, they're freaking out about recursion, and so they try to go to a search engine and find some explanation. Hopefully
Hmm.
that'll help them out, because it's when I looked on Amazon for other
Yeah.
books on recursion, I found this one book that first was written in the 80s in Pascal, and then for the 20th anniversary edition they came out with a
Hmm.
Java version, and then there's like a textbook on recursion, but it was very formal and academic, and I felt like, wow, okay, nobody's
Hmm.
really written about this. So um, yeah, it's kind of hard to come
Yeah.
up with. I try to
Huh.
either figure out concepts and topics that people haven't already written books about, or I try to find an audience that I could
Hmm.
sort of latch onto that would be interested, like teaching Python stuff, but in a way of interest to this one audience or something like that. Because there's so many books out there right now about
Yeah.
programming, and I get the feeling that with ChatGPT there will be a lot more self-published books thrown out. Um, very poorly written with large amounts of errors in them. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, it is sort
Yeah.
of the main thing that ChatGPT seems to be good at is generating lots of text of grammatically correct sentences that sound very confident and are mostly right, but not entirely.
Hmm.
And the main use case I see for
Yeah.
that is coming up with content spam for all these websites where you try to find a pasta recipe and there's a billion sidebar ads and they tell you their life story and you just want to know the ingredients and how to cook
Mhm.
this pasta dish. um, it makes me realize
Yep.
how great something like Wikipedia is, where there's no advertising at all and it's can be edited by anyone and there's no real profit motive
Mhm.
behind that, and yet it's basically the highest quality website on the entire internet.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, there's some people who will intentionally, uh, edit
Yeah,
things incorrectly,
and I
but
remember there
it
was
usually gets corrected
I
fairly
think on
quickly,
like on
so
some BBC website there was uh apparently somebody had posted about they made up a name for somebody who invented the electric toaster, and it was up on Wikipedia for a few months, and um
Mhm.
but then somebody found out about it and it got taken down pretty quickly. But it was the article tried to make it appear as this giant scandal
Mhm.
because scandals are get people to click on them. um, but I tried to find, like looking for other people,
Yep.
just googling the fake name they had, and really nobody had actually read this information. There were a couple of websites that had clearly just copied whatever information off of Wikipedia, but I was astounded because it really was just
Mhm.
like, I don't know, half a dozen websites, and there's one YouTube channel of a guy who had like 7,000 subscribers, which is really not all that much. But
Mhm.
it does have this huge boogeyman
Yeah.
of like, oh, you can't trust anything on Wikipedia. It's like, well, can't really trust anything, any information. Really, that's why we have, critical thinking skills and a general skepticism and media literacy, and hopefully anyway. um
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so how have you found
Cool.
ChatGPT? What do you mostly use it for? Because I've been using it as like a technical reviewer, and sometimes I have it generate really really simple programs in Python, and they kind of work. But sometimes I just use it in lieu of a search engine because there's so much
Mhm.
content spam out there. But I don't know. What have you been using it for?
Yeah. Well,
Oh
I'm
yeah,
actually kind of
yeah.
late to the party.
Same,
I've only
same
used it
there.
for, like, a couple of months now, but, um, so, I've looked at I was using it for Pandas because Pandas is something that I only just recently, like, in the last 6 months, have really started using on the job, and I'm like, "This is a tool that can teach me, some techniques in Pandas, or at least give me some ideas of further research," and it does an okay job at that. It doesn't always give you good code, but it gives you some ideas of where to go. What did I have it do? Oh, I wanted it to go to teach me how to like web scrape and then use pandas to teach me about the data that it had downloaded. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
the first
Oh
web scraping example it wrote was garbage
yeah. It's
and
everybody
didn't
who's
actually
used
scrape
this for like
anything.
generating code is used to,
Um,
it gives you the program and then you say that doesn't work because of this, and then it says I'm sorry, and then like gives you yet another program that's still
mhm.
busted but a little less so, and eventually you get something that kind of works
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, the first example, I think the website it used, something was wrong with the
Right.
way that website was. I think it's changed. GPT
Yeah, I
is
think right
based in
now
the
it says
past,
September of
not in current,
2021. uh
and so
yeah.
yeah, for 3.5, I believe. And if you have the 4.0, I think you can
Oh
actually have it
wow,
run
I have
against the internet itself if you
I
enable it.
don't think I've seen that.
That's what
I signed up
I
for
was
like the
told
the
anyway.
$20 a month sort of account, and GPT-4. Oh, okay. Oh,
It's a
okay,
beta
that'll be
feature.
interesting to
You have
check
to
out.
enable it
But
specifically. Yeah, I don't know how many I don't know if it's one of
mm,
those things that they're testing, so not everyone gets it, or if you just have to go in and set it. I keep
Oh
hearing
man,
about
just having
that
it
feature, and I want
access
to try it
the
out.
live internet would that'll be an interesting uh, thing to see. I wonder how well that'll actually work.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if it'll make it even slower because
Oh yeah,
I've heard
there's
mixed things about
definitely
the
a
4.0 one
slight
being
delay.
slower
Like
than
3.5 will
3.5.
usually come up with something almost immediately, whereas 4.5 you definitely see like the text being generated a little bit of at a time, but it's still reasonably fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not bad. And besides, if I'm going to ask you the question,
That is
I'm probably
definitely
going to keep
something that I've
researching
done, especially when
while
I'm
it
just
generates the
copying and
answer
pasting
anyway.
massive
So,
amounts of text for it to analyze. It's yeah, and then of course
hmm
I need to take some time to read through and figure out if it's hallucinating some other answers. Have you heard about the lawyers in New
yeah.
York who used ChatGPT for one of their case filings, and it turned out the cases that it was referencing were just completely made
Um,
up. And yeah, so the judge
no, I hadn't
pulled
heard
them
about
up
that.
uh, just for I don't know the proper term, but some form of like censure for them. I don't think they were threatened with being disbarred, but
Mm,
it was a very serious thing because when you're a lawyer and you put your name
yeah.
on it saying like this is all accurate, and then it turns out no, they just had ChatGPT
hmm
generate it and they just assumed it was correct, and ChatGPT had just made up these cases. I believe it was
hmm
about like an airline lawsuit,
Yeah.
and the cases that it generated sounded reasonable. But yeah, it was. I get the feeling that this
Yeah.
isn't the first time lawyers have done this. It's the first time that lawyers have gotten caught doing this. Um, so hey, we could just start copying and
hmm
pasting a bunch of filings to ChatGPT and ask it to see like, hey, do these cases actually made up? Are these made up? But yeah, the interesting thing with that is that it wasn't that somebody had put
hmm
false cases into some legal database somewhere and ChatGPT was looking that up. ChatGPT just made up like whoever versus whoever,
hmm
and because the thing with these large
Yeah.
language models is that they're mostly generating plausible sounding answers, which are most often correct, kind
hmm
of, sort of, but not always. And it's one of those things like, would you really want to fly with a pilot who you know doesn't crash the plane 95% of the time? That's, hey, 95, that's pretty good. 19 times out of 20 he doesn't crash.
hmm
Yeah, it's
Yeah. I think it was a month or two ago. I heard someone talking about he was an expert in some obscure scientific uh, disciplines. I think it was a type of medicine, and he was like, "Let's see how good ChatGPT is." And he asked it questions about it, and it cited some stuff he'd never read before. And he's like, "That's interesting because I wrote a lot of the original stuff." And so he went and looked it up. And he's like, it was generating, references that didn't exist, but it doubled down and was like, these two they exist. They're referenced over here, and those were made up too. And
and
it's kind of like a wormhole. You're like
and
going
just
all over the
imagine
place,
once
looking at all these
content
made up
farm
references to
websites
each
start
other.
using these LLMs to generate the content for their websites, which then gets used as the training data for future
hmm
LLMs. Yeah, this is sort of the danger. It's not that
Yeah.
AIs are gonna build robots that hunt humans down, or something like that. It's just that it very well could just turn
hmm
the internet into even more of a dumpster fire, which is a very impressive feat. Um, but already, a lot of people are complaining that like Google just isn't as
Yeah.
great as it was 10 years ago. Um, you have to just automatically click, to like 10, all the first 10 links and open them in separate tabs and then just sort of sift through them just to find like which are the websites that have actual information on them and which
hmm
are them are just very clearly just playing the SEO game and trying to get clicks.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've noticed there seems to be a lot of copywriters right now that are contacting me asking if I need copywriting
Oh
services,
yeah.
and they're using ChatGPT. You can tell just by reading the examples that they
Yes.
give you. That's supposed to be their portfolio, but it's obviously
Yeah. Yeah.
they're using GPT or
And the
Google
trouble is,
Bard or
it's really
something.
hard to have
That's not.
kind of sober thoughts about ChatGPT. It's really easy to buy into the hype because, of course, this we're sort of in the golden age of large language models right now, where you can use a service like ChatGPT, and it's actually pretty nice to talk to ChatGPT. You just type your question in, and it gives you a response, and it doesn't throw 20
Hmm.
million pop-up ads or tries to add suggestions for
Yeah.
a product or a political candidate in the response that it's giving you. Cory Doctorow describes this as the
Hmm.
enshittification process of websites, where it's like, oh, Twitter was so great 10 years ago, what happened to that? Or this website was so great 10 years ago. It's like, well, a lot of these websites, they build up their great websites and
Hmm.
or their great products, and they build up a huge following and loyal customers, and then people start
Hmm.
making short-sighted decisions in order to boost profit in the short term, and then pretty soon it like just becomes what it is.
Yeah.
And so right now, ChatGPT is kind of fun to work with, and you can play around with it, and it's really interesting, and people are coming up with all sorts of neat little
Hmm.
apps for it. Some of them are good, and some of them are just sort of mediocre. But I really hope that we don't get
Yeah.
the same thing that's happened to like every other technology. We're sort of in the beginning stages of it, and so a lot of people buy into the hype, and they always say like, well, 5 years from now, like right now it's producing garbage, but who knows, in five
Yeah.
years it's going to replace all software developers, and we won't need people writing programming books because you can have
Yeah.
ChatGPT teach you how to program, and it only lies to you 25% of the time. But in the future, but 5 years from now, it might only lie to you 19% of the time. That's an improvement.
Yeah. It is an improvement, I'll give you that.
Oh,
Oh, boy. Well, I think we've covered all the topics I planned to talk about, and we covered some extra ones I wasn't planning to talk about at all, so I think this has been a great
yeah,
episode, and I've had
it's
a lot
great
of
being
fun,
here.
having you on the show,
I
Al.
just
I
started
hope you've enjoyed
messing
it.
around with ChatGPT because I talked with Eric Maths, the author of Python Crash Course, at PyCon this
Mhm.
year in Salt Lake City back in April, and he said, well, because I was just really rolling my eyes about ChatGPT and
Mhm.
everything. And he says, no, actually take a look at it. GPT-4
Yeah.
is there is a noticeable improvement over 3.5 as far as generating code, and I've found that to be true. Um, but there's definitely some limitations to it, but there
Mhm.
are also some really interesting things, and it'll be interesting to see where this technology goes. I'm sure we're being promised the moon right now, but after a while it will shake
Yeah.
it out and probably find that like, oh, this will be a very interesting tool to use. But it's not going to replace the tool
Yeah, I
holder
hope so.
anytime soon.
No. Yeah, but right now I'm not impressed with it to that degree, but it definitely has a lot of interesting use
All right,
cases.
yeah, this has been really great.
But yeah, so anyway, I want to say thank you for coming to the show. Y'all who are listening should definitely check out Al's
Oh
amazing
yeah,
books, and I believe you have a Udemy course and
yeah.
maybe other cool stuff that
Yeah,
you can check out. Do you have
inventwithpython
links for that on your website,
basically
by the
has all
way?
my books and links to like videos and other things. I have alsweigart.com, but my last name is kind of hard
Hmm.
to spell out. Um, where I have a ton of links, but you can find all the links at inventwithpython.com, and
Yeah.
I have a blog that I don't really update as much as I should, and other like book projects. I'm hoping to have the rough drafts for the third edition of Automate the Boring Stuff done, let's say sometime in the fall, and then it'll be out hopefully next year in 20 early 2024.
Okay.
And then I have about 30 other book projects that I want to
Okay,
work
cool.
on as well.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I have all these ideas, but
Yeah, well, it's been
not
great
enough time to
being
work
on
on
this
them.
show.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, and hopefully we'll have you
That'd be
on
great.
maybe after you've released your book again. You can talk about it. All right, good.
Yeah,
For now,
talk to you soon.
I'll see you later and talk to you soon.
The Python Show.